Good to see everybody tonight, and I'm glad you can join us. Thank you for those who may be joining us online. We're glad that you can tune in tonight as well as we continue our Bible study on the names of God. And tonight, perhaps no name of God is more well known than the one we're going to talk about tonight, which is Jehovah Jireh. There's been songs about it. Poems, and you see it on artwork. Perhaps it's most well known because it's one of those that's a part of a well-known Bible story in the Bible, and if you grew up reading or studying or hearing the King James Version of the Bible used is straight from the King James Version. It says Jehovah Jireh right there in the Bible in the text. Not all translations have that word, and as we will see tonight, as I'll be reading out the New King James, but we'll kind of talk about that. But this name reveals to us the characteristic of God as a provider. Now, God revealed this about himself to Abraham, who had already experienced a number of tests in his life. You might remember one of the first ones. He told him to get up and leave the country, leave his land, leave his family, leave his homeland, and go to a land. God said, I'll tell you when you get there. That kind of thing. He had a trial whenever he encountered a king. He was in a kind of a foreign land as he was making this journey. He's in a foreign land and he's scared of the king. And so he tells the king that his wife is actually a sister. And that gets him in a mess. He lied about his sister. Or about his wife being his sister. Then he has the deal with his nephew Lot, who ends up getting captured by an enemy king and a foreign heathen nation. And he ends up having to gather up some of his servants, and they went to war actually and did like a little covert operation and rescued Lot from this neighboring heathen nation. But this particular event in his life had to be the greatest test to date. And as I said before, God often reveals his various names to his people, in the Bible by using or even sometimes orchestrating the circumstances of their lives. So sometimes he allows us to go through things. Other times, he literally orchestrates it so that these circumstances happen so he can teach us something about himself. And this was the case with Jehovah Jireh. It is this event in his life that Abraham, and I want us to walk through these kind of circumstances behind his coming to know, or God's revealing to him this truth about himself. And hopefully we can apply it to the circumstances of our lives even today. Okay? So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. I'm sorry, I should have told you that at the beginning. So Genesis 22 is where we're going to start. And we're going to be reading a little bit and kind of jumping around, kind of talking. Read a little bit, talk, read a little bit, talk. So that's how we're going to do it tonight. And the scriptures I'm reading from the New King James will be on the screen, as well as you can follow along in your text if you will want. So we're going to go to verses 1 and 2. Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2. It says, Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and said to him, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, first thing I want us to understand about these circumstances of life from which God revealed himself as Jehovah Jireh to Abraham, and consequently to us, we can learn that about our own lives, is that God prepares us in conflict. There's a number of conflicts taking place here in this verse, these first two verses. God tells Abraham, first of all, he wants him to kill his son, his only son. Now, if you know anything about this history of Isaac and Abraham, Abraham had waited a long time, okay? God had told him, he's going to bless him with all these children. One day he went to him and said, look out there. See all those stars? I'm going to get you more children than them stars. See these sand here that you're standing upon? I'm going to give you more children, descendants, than there are sand that you're standing on right here. And he was like, okay, but I'm not that young anymore. And Sarah's not spring chicken anymore, I'm probably about 90. I'm probably in my 80s. She's in her 70s. We don't know, if this is going to happen. And they were just wondering. Well, a while went by. They kind of stepped out on their own. He had his own son with his Hagar, and finally he said, I'm going to figure stuff out. Which is kind of a side note. When we're learning about God's provision, you want God to provide what we're going to learn tonight. You can't try to go off and do it yourself. You can't say, I'm going to provide for myself and then say that God did it, right? That's not how it works. If we're going to know God as provider, if we're going to know Jehovah Jireh, then we're going to have to understand that we got to do it God's way. That's what Abraham was learning. So God began preparing him by putting him through some conflicting circumstances. He tell him you're going to kill your child. And it's not just Abraham, anyone's child. Okay, Abraham had waited 25 years for this child to be born, for his son, his only son, right? And back then it was a big deal because if you didn't have a male descendant, you couldn't pass on like the heritage of your land, and that's how your family was guaranteed, like God's heritage get passed on to your family. So you needed your name passed on by a male, plus you needed that to kind of give you heritage to, for your wealth, your land, and all those kind of things. So Abraham, he's waited all this time, he gets his son, but it's not just that, it's waited, he's waiting on his son. It's his son. No one wants to kill their son, okay? No one wants to do that. Then we're dealing with child sacrificing. Even though the law wasn't established right now, the fact is that everybody knew you didn't do this. This was not something that was acceptable, okay? This was not something that was permitted by God for you to do child sacrifice. Of all the sacrifice they knew, it was animals and those kind of things, grains and, agricultural sacrifices. But there were no such thing. You didn't just sacrifice a person. It just wasn't something done. So he had that going on in what God was trying to tell him to do. And then he was also, which I don't see it here, but he was also stopping the covenant. Okay? So he was giving, for his son to go away, for his son to die, the covenant would end. Do you understand? Because God said, I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you this inheritance, this promise to you, to your sons, to your sons' sons, to your sons' sons' sons, to your, and right on down the line. To all your descendants, you will be blessed. But this blessing can't happen if it ends with him. It would just come to an end. So the covenant that we read in the Bible in the Old Testament, Abraham, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Joseph. We just go down the line. You start naming off all these descendants. If Isaac was dead, all that would be nothing. It would end. It would be done. So there was a lot of conflict going on here. And so this is where God begins to prepare Abraham. But understand this. When God allows you to experience times of conflict, when things that are going on, the circumstances of your life, just don't make any sense, then you might want to just wait a minute and understand that perhaps God is about to reveal himself to you in a special way. Okay? Not only does he prepare us through this conflict, we're going through some difficult times, sometimes when we're conflicted about how things are going, but also during confusion, he proves himself, or proves us in confusion. Notice this, look at verses 6 through 8. Genesis 22, we get back in our text. Now, I'll just kind of paraphrase up to this point, because Abraham, says in verse 3, I think, Abraham gets up early in the morning. You ever wonder why Abraham got up real early in the morning? Because he didn't want to explain this to Sarah. He's getting out of there before Sarah's awake. He's sneaking out the door before Sarah asks any questions, because he's going to have to explain what he's doing. And he don't explain to Sarah he's taking his son up on the mountain to sacrifice him. That's probably not going to go over with Sarah too good, okay? So he gets up early in the morning. As y'all know how you wives sometimes like to sleep in a little bit. He gets out of there before she gets up, sneaks out, and he's going up on making this journey with his servants and all of his stuff, making his way up there. And it gets up onto the mountain, and this is where we pick it up in verse 6 through 8. Verses 6 through 8, Genesis 22. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here am I, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Isaac had been there before, right? He had seen his dad do sacrifices before. He had been to something like this before, and he knew what was involved in it. He said, "I see the wood, I see the fire. Where is the sacrifice?" Now just put yourself in the shoes right there for a minute with Abraham, okay? What do you say? What answer do you give? I mean, at this point, we don't really know what's going through Abraham's mind. But we know he's a little confused. He's to one of those, I don't know. You ever had an I don't know moment? You ever had a moment where you just don't know? You don't know what's going on. You're confused. You're at a loss. You don't really know. You don't know what God's doing. You don't know where your life's going. You don't know how things are going to work out. That's kind of where we find Abraham. He's at one of them, I don't know. And if my child would ask me that, and I was in that situation, I said, I don't know. We'll worry about that later. I just don't know. Because that's honestly what I'd be thinking. But Abraham answers it in a great way. Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. You know what Abraham was saying? He says, "I don't know, but God's going to have to figure this out. God's going to have to do something because I don't know what's going on. I don't know how this is going to happen. I don't know how it's going to go down." Now, I've heard people say, and I've read, commentaries and heard sermons and messages, and you hear it taught in Sunday school, whatever, what was going through Abraham's mind. Did he think, God was going to, raise up Isaac from the dead? Was God going to intervene in somehow? I don't know what he was thinking, but we know that he really didn't know either. He's just giving it to God. He's just pointing back to God. He's saying, hey, God's going to have to do something. I can't do anything about this. And so God is proving us. He proves us. He tests us during those times of confusion. Are we going to trust Him? Are we going to depend totally upon Him? And this is kind of where Abraham was. Now, I have a feeling Abraham was convinced that no matter how God was going to do it, that God was going to bring his son back with him. This wasn't going to be the end of Isaac. So notice in verse 5, 22 verse 5, it says, and Abraham said to his young men, this is before they go up on the mountain with the wood and he gets questioned by Isaac. Abraham said to his young men, this is his servants, he says, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. He said, we will come back. He said, no, I'm not coming back. He didn't say I, singular. We will come back. So Abraham was convinced, even though he was confused of how it was going to work, he was in this serious conflict that was going on, but he was convinced that God was going to work it all out. Okay? Total trust. Had to be. For we know what happens next, right? So we know that God often uses confusing circumstances to prove us or to put us to the test. And that's exactly what God was doing here. And you might say, well, doesn't God know all things? And doesn't he? Yeah. He knows all things that are past, that are already happened. He knows all things that are happening now in the present. And he knows all things that are potentially to happen in the future. Because God exists outside of time and space. But that doesn't mean that God knows all things experientially or experientially. In other words, there are some things he doesn't know because he's never experienced it. God doesn't know what it's like to sin because he's never sinned. He doesn't know what that feeling feels like. Now, God became man in Jesus, and Jesus experienced all things we experience, but he still did not sin. Notice Hebrews chapter 5, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Jesus experienced the sin in person, and this is hard to understand because Jesus, the Son, experienced the consequence of sin and the punishment of sin and God's wrath upon sin, but God the Father never experienced that sin because God couldn't even look on sin. That's why whenever the sins of the entire human race were put on Jesus, what happened? God turned his back on his very Son. He couldn't even look at him. They were separated because of sin. So, what God does is God puts us to the test so that he, right along with us, can feel what we feel as we choose or don't choose to commit our lives to him. And that's when he can finally reveal himself to us as provider. God cannot get and show us as provider until he gets us to that point. And so I want you to notice the next point is God provides for us after we commit fully to him. Now, God's provision is conditional. This providing, this provider God, it's a conditional provision. Notice what he says here in chapter 22, verses 9 through 12. So he's up there. He's got his son going up there. He says, God's going to provide the sacrifice. Then they came to the place for which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in it in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Remember we talked about that last week? Moses, Moses. God calls your name twice. It's serious. It's time to get serious right here. And he said, here am I. Here I am anyway. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Notice God says in verse 12, now I know. He can now reveal himself to Abraham as provider because now Abraham has fully committed himself to God. He's committed everything he cherishes, everything that he has counted on, everything that he's looking forward to. His entire heritage of life, his entire existence of his life is wrapped up in this one son, and he's going to kill that son because he's committed his way to obeying the Lord. Now, that means we have a part to play, right? If the conditional is our part. So we have to completely trust in God. That means we got to take God seriously. When he said, now I know that you fear God, that means you take God seriously. That means we get serious about obeying him, completely obeying God. That means going the distance. That means going up the mountains of life. That means building the altar. That means binding up your son, binding up his son. That means raising up the blade. Now that he had to do all of that. If Abraham would have stopped anywhere along the way, he would have never known God as Jehovah Jireh. He wouldn't have missed the provision. He would have missed it. If he'd have stopped along the way. And you know what? Some people would have bailed out on God right about then, wouldn't they? Right about the time God says, okay, I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, and go up and slay him on it. Oh, done. I'm out. You know, they'd have took off. Because that conflicted with what they know to be good and what they know to be right. It conflicted with them. Confusion is the least of his concern. But he would say, no, this doesn't make any sense at all. No, I can't do that. We bail out. How many times do we go through difficult circumstances of life or uncertain circumstances or hard times in our life, things that we can't figure out, we don't understand what's going on, and we think, man, I know people that'll experience stuff like that, and what do? They stop coming to church. They stop being faithful. They stop reading their Bible. They stop praying. You know, when that kind of stuff happens, we should be more faithful to worship. We should be more faithful to Bible study. We should be more faithful to prayer. Because the more we commit our way to God and the more we trust in the Lord, that's when he's going to provide for us and he's going to show himself and prove himself as that provider. Notice verse 13. Then Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. This had to be the most quiet ram stuck in a thicket I ever heard, right? Because we don't have any indication that Isaac ever said a word. If I have my inclinations, I bet Isaac never spoke a word. Because remember, Isaac is a type of Christ. And Jesus went silent as a lamb to the slaughter on the cross. By the way, Abraham's blade was spared in Isaac. But Jesus was not spared on the cross. God's wrath and dagger of his wrath was buried deep into the hands and feet of Jesus. And that's the reason why we can be saved today. That was Jesus talking to Abraham. Yeah, exactly. This is Jesus, the angel of the Lord. This is who they say it is. So, but this ram is caught in a thicket. And I have a feeling, I might be wrong about this, but I have a feeling that that lamb was there the whole time. He just stuck over there. But God didn't reveal it to Abraham until Abraham had committed his way to God, until Abraham had fully trusted God, fully obeyed God, until Abraham had gotten to the place where God wanted him to be. Then God revealed to him what he had already provided. God had already given this. And so I'm thinking that a lot of times God's got our ram out there. And he wants to give it to us. But he can't reveal it to us until we completely trust in him. Until we completely let go and do our part of just obeying God. Sometimes that means you in a holding pattern, where you're not going anywhere, God, but you're going to trust God yet. It's sort of like standing still and waiting on the Lord. It's just being faithful, doing what you know to do now, and trusting that God is going to do His part. And if we get there, we do our part, I believe God will do His part. Now, God provides a substitute for Isaac, and He reveals something about Himself to Abraham and to us. Abraham calls the name of the place by the name of God, Jehovah Jireh. That's what he says. Notice verse 14. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now, interestingly enough, that's the New King James. Let's look at the King James. The King James Version, the Old King James, says, and Abraham called the name of that place, Jehovah Jireh, as it is said this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Did you see that? There are two translations here that give us clues into what the name Jireh, we already talked about Jehovah, the Lord Jehovah. We already talked about that last week. But this name Jireh, combined with Jehovah, means and what God's part looks like when He does it. There is both prevision and provision. New King James talks about, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Right? In the Old King James, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. That's because the word Jireh in Hebrew has both meaning to see, means God sees you, and to provide. Both words has a dual meaning, same meaning, with the same word. So we know when we think about God's part, God not only provides this prevision, but He also provides for us provision. Vision is in both words there, isn't it? Prevision and provision. Notice God wants to, let's see, I'm going to go back because I'm not ready to get there yet. So, first of all, in the prevision, God, He's the God who sees. Now, when you look at the word Moriah, which was the land of Moriah, also Mount Moriah, where all this took place, it actually comes from the same root Hebrew word that Jireh comes from. They come from the same word. So Moriah has the same idea that Jireh has. It is to see. So what God was telling Abraham, He says, go to the place where it is seen, or go to the place where it is seen, and it shall be seen. In other words, go to the place where I will see you, and you will see. You will see what? You will see that I will do my part, that I will provide for you. But you have to go to that place. You have to go and do those steps. You have to follow what I'm asking you to do. The Lord who sees your need. Even though you may not understand, even though you may not know what's going on, the Lord isn't unaware. He's not sitting up there in some faraway land, not knowing what's going on in your life. He is very much aware of what's happening, and He's very much watching and waiting to the right moment to provide for you. And that's where the provision comes in. God wants to provide you and for you. God's got your ram ready. I believe He's just waiting to reveal it to you once you do your part. So what does it mean and why does it matter? That's why we're doing this study. When we think about Jehovah Jireh, what does it mean and why does it matter? First, it means that God wants to provide for your needs. I don't think God is sitting up there going, oh, just mess up. Just mess up so I can take this blessing away from you. Just go off track. I just can't wait. You just cross that line so I can take this stuff. I don't think God is up there like that at all. Sometimes we think that in terms of our human, understanding. But God, I believe He's up there. He just wants to provide. He's like, man, I got all this stuff. I just want to bless you. I just want to give all this to you. I just want to, flood your life with this stuff. But you got to do your part. You got to get there. You got to obey. You got to go the distance. You got to commit. And so He's wanting to reveal Himself and provide. Notice that He said He's even promised to do so. Notice Philippians 4:19. Paul put it this way. He said, "But my God shall supply all your need according to His riches and glory by Christ Jesus." Did it say He might? My God might supply? Did it say that? Would He maybe supply? No, He said, my God shall supply. You know what that tells me? This is a promise. God has promised it. He has given you a promise. But did you know there's a difference between a promise and an oath? God makes promises, but God performs oaths. In other words, the promise is God saying, I will do something. The oath is, I'm going to do what I promised to do. That's Him doing it. And so there's a difference in this, and we notice it in this same story. Genesis, this is the rest of the story, Genesis 22, verses 15 to 18. Notice what happens here. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord. You know what that is? That's the promise, right? By myself I have sworn. I have already given you this promise. I told you I was going to bless you. I told you I was going to give you more children than you got stars in the sky, more children than there are sand of the desert. I already told you that, right? I gave you that promise. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, blessing I will bless you. And multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. God's promise wasn't negated based upon what Abraham did or didn't do. Do you understand? His promise still stands. It's still His promise. But if we want to see His promises avail in our life, we want to see those things actually happen, then for God to do what He said He's going to do, then sometimes it takes a little bit of stuff on our part. We got to do our part. Promises that Abraham had sworn to do to Abraham, or God had sworn to do to Abraham in the past. The oath, His oath was actual performing this in response to Abraham's obedience. If you want to know God as provider, you want to know God as Jehovah Jireh, then you must first trust Him as Lord. You see, you can't have Jireh without Jehovah. Right? It's sort of like last week we talked about, you want to know Adonai, well then you got to know Jehovah, right? You got to get Jehovah, then you get Adonai. So you can't have the one without the other. I can't say, God provide for me, and I just do whatever I want. I just live like I want and expect God is just going to provide for me. No, that's not the way it works. I got to make Him Lord. I got to make Him Master. I got to make Him the one who's in control. Once I make Him Lord and Master, then He will provide Himself and show Himself and reveal Himself as Jireh. Don't forget, God sees you. You just need to take Him seriously. Trust Him. And get serious about trusting Him. Obey Him. Whatever it is. Hey, say, well, I don't really know what to do next. Well, just do what you know to do now. Just keep doing what you know. Maybe God's got you in a holding pattern. You know? Maybe God's got you going just in a holding pattern, just round and round in a circle. But just do that until God points the way or opens the door or tells you what to do next. And if you'll do that, I guarantee you God will do His part and He will provide. That's how we know Him, and we get Him known as Jehovah Jireh. We're going to go ahead and go to our prayer time now. At this time, if you have a prayer request, if you're watching online and you have a prayer request you'd like to share with us, you can do it in the comments. You can go to our website and leave it there, and we'll be praying for those requests throughout the week. or those of you who are in person, we will take requests here tonight. But we appreciate you joining us online. We're going to say goodbye for now, and hope that God continues to bless you and your family always.